Hey guys, tonight we venture back into the darkness, not the metaphorical kind, but the real, tangible, all-consuming darkness of a world before the switch. We like to think we know the night. We've romanticized it, written poetry about it, turned it into a backdrop for city lights and late-night movies. Our night is a tamed thing, a comfortable space curated by blackout curtains, white noise machines, and the gentle hum of the refrigerator. We control the dark. We can banish it with the flick of a finger. It serves us. But what if it didn't? What if, when the sun went down, the world didn't just get dark? What if it transformed into another place entirely? A place ruled by a different set of laws, inhabited by different creatures, and filled with a kind of visceral, primal fear that most of us can no longer even imagine. Tonight, we're not just talking about how medieval people slept. We're journeying into the long medieval night itself, a world where darkness wasn't an absence of light, but a physical presence. So dim your lamps, lock your doors, and let's step into a time when the night had teeth. Before electricity, before streetlights, before even the widespread use of reliable glass windows, darkness was absolute. Imagine a blackness so profound it felt like a substance, a thick, inky ocean that swallowed landscapes, erased horizons, and muffled the very air you breathed. On a moonless, overcast night, you couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. The world beyond your door ceased to exist visually. It became a landscape of sound, smell, and pure, unadulterated dread. This wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a fundamental threat. The night was a predator, and humanity was its prey. The first and most immediate fear was, of course, other humans. With no police force to call and city gates, often locked until dawn, the night belonged to those who thrived in shadow. Footpads, burglars, and violent criminals treated the darkness as their professional office space. A flimsy wooden door and a simple bolt were all that stood between your family and a man with a knife and nothing to lose. Every creak of the floorboards, every dog's bark in the distance, every rustle in the thatch of your roof was a potential home invasion. Sleep wasn't a peaceful escape. It was an act of faith, a gamble that you'd wake up with all your possessions and all your limbs still attached. But the human threat was in many ways the least of their worries. An even more terrifying monster lurked in every home: fire. In a world built of wood, wattle, and straw, lit by open hearths and flickering tallow candles, fire was the era's most popular method of both heating and accidental demolition. A single errant spark from the fireplace, a candle knocked over by a draft or a restless cat, could turn a home into an inferno in minutes. A house fire wouldn't just kill a family. It could consume an entire neighborhood, a whole city block, leaping from one thatched roof to the next like a demon sent from hell. The smell of smoke in the middle of the night wasn't an annoyance. It was the apocalypse arriving at your doorstep. And then there was the fear that transcended the physical. For the medieval mind, the night was not empty. It was crowded. This was the time when the veil between worlds grew thin, when the supernatural came out to play. The darkness was crawling with ghosts, demons, malevolent spirits, and all manner of things that defied explanation. They believed the devil and his minions were most active after sundown, seeking to tempt, torment, and snatch away unwary souls. That strange noise wasn't just the wind. It could be the wail of a banshee foretelling a death in the family. That fleeting shape in the corner of your eye wasn't a trick of the light. It was an imp sent to curdle your milk and give you nightmares. The night was a spiritual obstacle course. Every shadow held a potential sin. Every nightmare a possible demonic visitation. People didn't just go to sleep. They armed themselves with prayers, clutched crucifixes, and whispered charms, hoping their spiritual antivirus software was up to date enough to survive until sunrise. The darkness wasn't just scary because you couldn't see. It was scary because of what you believed you could. But it wasn't just a silent, creeping terror. The medieval night was loud. In fact, for anyone living in a town or city, it was a relentless, chaotic assault on the ears, the original white noise machine. But with more shouting and plague. Forget the gentle chirping of crickets. Picture instead a cacophony of human and animal life packed together within stone walls, with nothing but thin layers of wood and plaster to muffle the sound. The first and most dominant sound was the church bell. It wasn't the gentle, melodic chime we imagine today. These were massive, booming instruments of bronze, and they didn't just ring on Sunday. They tolled throughout the day, and, most importantly, throughout the night, marking the canonical hours for the monks at the local monastery. The bell for matins could shatter the silence at 2 or 3 in the morning. A holy alarm clock you couldn't snooze, reminding everyone not only of God's omnipresence, but of your own profound lack of uninterrupted sleep. Then there was the human noise. Taverns and alehouses were the social hubs of medieval life, and they didn't close politely at 11. They stayed open. As long as there were coins to be spent and ale to be drunk, the sounds of raucous singing, drunken arguments, and the occasional full-blown brawl would spill out into the narrow, winding streets. Doors would slam, people would shout farewells or curses. The city watch, if your town was lucky enough to have one, would patrol the streets, their main job seeming to be shouting that everything was fine right before it wasn't. Their calls of all's well, echoing through the dark as a thief, quietly jimmied a lock 2 streets over. Inside your own home, privacy was a myth. In crowded tenements, you could hear everything. Your neighbor's coughing fits, the cries of a sick baby, a tragically common sound, the creak of a bed, a muffled argument through a wall no thicker than your hand. And of course, there were the animals. Medieval cities weren't the sanitized urban environments of today. They were functioning agricultural centers. Livestock lived side by side with people. The night air was filled with the sounds of dogs barking at shadows, pigs snorting in backyard pens, the panicked clucking of chickens in a coop being raided by a fox, and the lonely lowing of a cow. These animals weren't beloved pets kept indoors. They were a living, breathing, and very loud part of the urban orchestra. The symphony of the medieval night was a bizarre mix of the sacred and the profane, the human and the beastly, a constant hum of life that made true silence an unimaginable luxury. If the sounds were overwhelming, the smells were a physical assault. The night air, thick with moisture and stillness, trapped the day's odors and concentrated them into a pungent, inescapable miasma. Sanitation, as we know it, did not exist. There were no sewer systems. The primary method of waste disposal was the chamber pot, and its contents were often unceremoniously hurled from an upper-story window into the street below, accompanied by a perfunctory shout of Gardyloo. If you were lucky, the narrow, unpaved streets were open sewers, channels of mud, animal dung, rotting garbage, and human effluent. By night, this vile stew would fester, releasing an eye-watering stench that seeped through cracks in doors and walls. It wasn't a background smell. It was the atmosphere you breathed. Add to that the smoke from countless wood and peat fires, the smell of tanneries and slaughterhouses that operated within the city walls, and the overpowering scent of hundreds of unwashed human bodies crammed into small spaces, and you have an olfactory experience that modern noses are simply not equipped to handle. The medieval night didn't just sound or look different. It had a smell all its own. A thick, earthy, and deeply unpleasant perfume of life and decay, all mixed together in the dark. But what if you weren't a common peasant, huddled in a drafty cottage? What if you were a lord, a duke, or a king? What if you had stone walls, armed guards, and a moat between you and the chaos of the medieval night? Surely then, sleep was a peaceful, luxurious affair. Well, yes and no. The noble sleep was certainly safer and warmer, but it was far from simple. In fact, for the aristocracy, going to bed was less an act of rest and more a highly choreographed piece of theater, a spiritual and political operation that began long before the lights went out. First, let's talk about the bedchamber. This wasn't a private sanctuary, like a modern bedroom. It was a semi-public space, an extension of the court. It was where the lord or lady would receive their most trusted advisors for a final word, where documents might be signed, and where status was performed. The room itself was a display of wealth. It would have tapestries on the walls for insulation and decoration, a roaring fireplace with a chimney, a rare luxury, and perhaps even a private latrine or garderobe built into the castle wall. The centerpiece of this room, and indeed of the noble's entire domestic life, was the bed. It was less a piece of furniture and more a small fortified principality, a massive, ornately carved wooden structure. The noble bed was a four-poster hung with multiple layers of heavy, often embroidered, velvet or brocade curtains. These weren't just for show. They created a small insulated tent within the drafty stone room, a bedchamber in the most literal sense, trapping body heat and offering the only real sliver of privacy one could hope for. Inside this fabric fortress were layers of feather beds, fine linen sheets, and fur-lined blankets. It was the absolute pinnacle of medieval comfort. Yet, this comfort came with a strange condition. You were almost never truly alone. High-ranking nobles were surrounded by servants day and night. The process of getting ready for bed was an elaborate ritual involving numerous attendants. There were servants to help them undress, servants to bring them a final cup of spiced wine, and most intimately, the groom of the stool for the king, a high-status courtier whose job involved assisting the monarch with his toilet. Even once in bed, a trusted servant or a knight of the household might sleep on a simple pallet at the foot of their master's bed, acting as a personal bodyguard. Imagine the sheer strangeness of it, drifting off to sleep while another person is sitting in a chair in the corner of your room, silently watching, listening to you breathe, tasked with protecting you from assassins who might slip past the dozens of other guards in the castle. For the nobility, absolute privacy was as alien a concept as absolute silence. The ritual of sleep was also deeply entwined with security and spirituality. As night fell, the castle would undergo a lockdown procedure that would make a modern military base proud. The drawbridge was raised, the portcullis was lowered, gates were barred, and sentries took their positions on the battlements, their calls echoing across the courtyards. The lord of the castle was acutely aware that his home was not just a residence, but a fortress, and the night was the time for sieges, raids, and treachery. His sleep depended entirely on the vigilance of his men. Spiritually, the routine was just as rigid. A noble family would gather for evening prayers, or compline, often led by a private chaplain in their personal chapel. The prayers were longer, the rituals more elaborate than those of a peasant. They prayed for protection, not only from demons, but from political enemies, from poison, and from the ever-present threat of plague. It was a formal appeal to the highest authority for a peaceful night in a world that was anything but. For the medieval elite, sleep wasn't an escape from their duties. It was the final, most vulnerable duty of the day, a performance of power and piety staged in a fortress of fabric and stone, a fragile island of order in the vast howling darkness outside. If the city night was a chaotic opera of human activity, the rural night was a different beast altogether. Out in the countryside, beyond the dubious safety of town walls, the darkness was deeper, the silence more profound, and the fears older, more primal. Here, in the scattered villages and isolated farmsteads that made up the vast majority of the medieval world, the night wasn't just a time of day. It was an encroaching wilderness, a hostile territory that began at the edge of your flickering candlelight. The typical peasant home, a simple wattle and daub hut with a thatched roof and a packed earth floor, was less a fortress and more a suggestion of shelter. It offered little resistance to the elements, and even less to determined intruders, whether human or animal. When the sun disappeared, the family, often a large, multi-generational unit, would huddle together in a single smoky room. The fire in the central hearth was the heart of the home, the sole source of heat and light. It was a beacon against the oppressive blackness, but it was a fragile one. Tending the fire was a critical, round-the-clock responsibility. Letting it die out wasn't just an inconvenience. It was an invitation for the biting cold and the symbolic darkness to invade the very core of their existence. Life in these huts was a shared affair, and not just with other people. The line between human and animal living space was blurry at best. On cold nights, it was common practice to bring valuable livestock, a prized cow, a few sheep, or a flock of chickens inside the hut. This wasn't a quirky lifestyle choice. It was a brutally practical heating and security strategy. The animals generated precious body heat, raising the ambient temperature of the cramped space by a few life-saving degrees. Bringing them inside also protected them from predators, both the four-legged and two-legged kind. The downside, of course, was sharing your sleeping space with a collection of smelly, noisy, and hygienically challenged roommates. The air would be thick with the smell of manure, damp fur, and straw. The night would be punctuated by the soft grunts of a pig, the rustle of chickens, or the sudden, startling bleat of a sheep. Waking up with a goat's hoof, inches from your face, was just part of the medieval rural experience. But the most pervasive fear in the countryside wasn't of thieves or cold. It was of the wilderness itself. The forests and uncultivated lands that surrounded every village were not the idyllic nature preserves we imagine today. They were dark, dangerous, and in the medieval imagination, deeply enchanted places. These were the stomping grounds of wolves. Wolf packs were a real and constant threat, especially in winter when food was scarce. They would snatch livestock, and stories of them attacking and killing lone travelers, or even children, were terrifyingly common. Every howl that pierced the night silence was a reminder of the sharp-toothed hunger that prowled just beyond the flimsy fence of the village. Beyond the real wolves were the supernatural ones. The forest was the domain of things that did not belong in the human world. It was home to fairies, goblins, ancient spirits of the wood, and beings far more sinister. Folklore was not entertainment. It was a survival guide. It taught you which paths to avoid after dark, which streams were haunted, and why you should never ever answer if you hear your name called from the woods at night. The peasant's fear was layered. There was the rational fear of a bear or a wolf, and layered on top of that was the equally real, equally potent fear of a malevolent nature spirit, or a demon disguised as a lost child. The night was when the boundaries of the known world dissolved, and the rules of the forest, ancient, magical, and utterly indifferent to human life, took over. Barring the door of your hut at night wasn't just about keeping out the cold. It was about shutting out a world of chaos both natural and supernatural, and praying your small circle of firelight would be enough to hold it at bay until morning. So you've survived the terrors of the night, real and imagined. You've navigated the symphony of urban chaos or the menacing silence of the countryside. But what happens when the enemy isn't outside your door, but inside your own head? What happens when sleep, the precious, fleeting escape you crave, simply refuses to come? In our modern world, we have an entire industry dedicated to combating insomnia. We have melatonin gummies, sleep tracking apps, mindfulness podcasts, and an endless pharmacopoeia of prescription aids. But in the Middle Ages, when you found yourself wide awake at 3 a.m., staring into the oppressive darkness, what did you do? You turned to a strange and fascinating blend of folk medicine, religious faith, and pure, unadulterated superstition. The first line of defense was often herbal. Medieval people had a deep and practical knowledge of the plants that grew around them, a kind of living apothecary in every field and garden. Certain herbs were renowned for their soporific qualities. Lavender, with its calming scent, was a popular choice. It might be stuffed into a small pillow or sachet and placed near the head. Valerian root, a potent sedative still used today, was known for its ability to induce a heavy, dream-filled sleep. Hops, the same plant that gives beer its bitter flavor, were also used. A pillow stuffed with dried hop flowers was a common remedy for restlessness. Other popular choices included chamomile, lemon balm, and St. John's wort. These remedies were often prepared as infusions, what we would call herbal tea, or simply consumed raw. It was a gentle, nature-based approach, a quiet negotiation with the body's own rhythms. When herbs failed, the next step was often the kitchen. Certain foods and drinks were believed to promote restfulness. A cup of warm milk, sometimes sweetened with honey or spiced with nutmeg, was a timeless comfort believed to soothe the stomach and calm the mind. A concoction known as a caudle, a warm drink made from wine or ale, thickened with eggs and spices, was another popular nightcap. It was both nourishing and intoxicating, a gentle push into slumber. Of course, the logic could be counterintuitive. Some medical texts, based on the theory of the four humors, might advise a person with a cold and moist constitution to avoid such things, prescribing instead something hot and dry to rebalance their internal system. Medieval medicine was a complex and often contradictory guessing game. If medicine and diet didn't work, you turned to a higher power. Insomnia wasn't just a physical ailment. It could be a spiritual one. Perhaps your sleeplessness was a sign of a guilty conscience, a punishment for some unconfessed sin. The solution was prayer. You would recite psalms, the Ave Maria, or a personal, desperate plea for peace. Some saints were specifically known as patrons against nocturnal troubles. You might pray to Saint Dymphna, the patron saint of mental and nervous disorders, or Saint Giles, who was often invoked for protection against fear of the night. This wasn't just about calming the mind. It was about spiritual warfare. Your inability to sleep could be a demonic attack, an attempt by evil forces to weary your soul and make you vulnerable to temptation. Prayer was your shield and your sword, a way of actively fighting back against the unseen enemies of the dark. And when all else failed, you got desperate. Some folk remedies bordered on the bizarre and the magical. One might be advised to place a knife under the bed to cut away bad dreams, or to hang a hagstone, a stone with a natural hole through it, above the bed to trap evil spirits. Some beliefs were even more peculiar. It was thought that sleeping with your head pointing north could cause restlessness, as it aligned you with the cold, chaotic energies of the world. Even more extreme measures existed. For the wealthy who could afford a physician, the go-to solution for almost any ailment, including sleeplessness, was bloodletting. The theory was that insomnia was caused by an excess of blood in the head, and releasing some of it would restore balance and bring calm. It was a brutal, often dangerous procedure that likely left the patient too weak and faint to do anything but sleep. For the medieval insomniac, the quest for rest was a journey through a landscape of faith, folklore, and frighteningly bad medical advice. A testament to the universal human desire for a few hours of peace in a troubled world. The long, perilous night is finally over. The first faint, gray light of dawn begins to seep over the horizon, chasing away the ghosts and silencing the wolves. The ordeal is finished. But how do you know it's time to start a new one? In a world without alarm clocks, without smartphones buzzing on the nightstand, without even a standardized concept of time, the act of waking up was a communal, natural, and far less jarring experience than our own abrupt, digitally enforced awakenings. The medieval world woke up together, summoned by a series of ancient and reliable signals from God and nature. The first and most universal alarm clock was, of course, the rooster. The Gallus domestic was an indispensable part of nearly every household, from the peasant's hut to the castle courtyard. Its loud, piercing crow at the break of dawn was a biological signal that had governed the rhythm of human life for centuries. It was a sound so reliable that it became deeply embedded in the culture and religion of the era. In Christian symbolism, the rooster's crow represented the triumph of light over darkness, of Christ over Satan. It was the sound of resurrection, a daily reminder that the world had been saved from the terrors of the night once more. When the rooster crowed, it wasn't just an animal making noise. It was nature itself announcing that it was safe to begin the day. For those living in towns, cities, or near a monastery, the second great alarm was the bell. Just as the bells marked the prayer times throughout the night, they announced the beginning of the new day with loud, insistent peals. The bell for prime, the first prayer service of daylight, around 6 a.m., was the signal for the entire community to stir. It was the sound of the world getting back to business. Markets would begin to open, craftsmen would fire up their forges, and the streets would slowly begin to fill with the sounds of carts and commerce. The church bell was the pacemaker of medieval society, a shared clock that synchronized the lives of everyone within its earshot. It created a collective rhythm, a sense that the day did not belong to the individual, but to the community as a whole. You didn't wake up on your own schedule. You woke up on God's schedule, and the bell was his messenger. And then there was the most fundamental signal of all, the light. Without thick curtains or artificial lighting to interfere, the natural cycle of the sun was a powerful regulator of sleep. The first rays of sunlight filtering through an oiled parchment window, a crack in the wooden shutters, or simply the open doorway of a hut were a gentle but persistent call to rise. The body's own circadian rhythm, finely tuned to the patterns of light and dark, would respond naturally. Waking up wasn't a violent transition from deep sleep to full alertness. It was a gradual process, an easing into consciousness that mirrored the slow brightening of the world outside. Your body knew it was morning because the world itself told it so. This gradual, communal awakening stands in stark contrast to our modern experience. Our alarm clocks are instruments of violence. They jolt us out of sleep with harsh beeps, blaring music, or simulated sunrises that our bodies know are fake. Our schedule is individualistic and relentlessly precise. We wake up at 6:47 a.m., not because the community needs us, but because our digital calendar tells us we have a Zoom meeting at 8 o'clock. The medieval person woke up as part of a collective, their day dictated by the sun, the church, and the needs of the agricultural season. We wake up alone, dictated by the unforgiving logic of the clock. Their morning was a shared ritual, a slow re-entry into a world governed by natural and divine time. Ours is a private, panicked scramble against a deadline. In losing the medieval night, we may have gained safety and convenience, but in losing the medieval morning, we may have lost something more profound, a sense of rhythm, of community, and of our own place in the natural order of the world. Tonight, we step out of the darkness and into the fire. We're delving into a world of bubbling alembics, cryptic symbols, and a dream so audacious, so intoxicating, that it obsessed the greatest minds for over 1,000 years. We're talking, of course, about alchemy. Now, when most of us hear that word, a very specific image pops into our heads. A greedy, bearded old man in a dusty, cluttered workshop, hunched over a crucible, cackling as he tries to turn lead into gold. It's a caricature of ambition and foolishness, the ultimate get-rich-quick scheme of the pre-modern world. And sure, there was plenty of that. History is littered with charlatans who promised kings they could refill their treasuries and ended up, predictably, losing their heads. But to dismiss alchemy as nothing more than a fool's quest for gold is to miss the point entirely. It's like saying space exploration is just about finding cool rocks. The truth is far grander, far stranger, and infinitely more profound. Turning lead into gold wasn't the ultimate goal of true alchemy. It was just the proof of concept. The real prize wasn't wealth. It was perfection. Alchemists weren't just trying to transform metal. They were trying to unlock the secrets of God, to understand the fundamental grammar of creation, and in doing so, to perfect not only matter, but themselves. They were chasing a trio of legendary artifacts that made simple gold look like a consolation prize. The Philosopher's Stone, the elixir of life, and the universal solvent. It was a quest for power, immortality, and ultimate knowledge. So let's fire up the furnace, open the forbidden texts, and explore the dream that went far beyond gold. Step inside the alchemist's laboratory, the sanctum sanctorum, where the great cosmic drama of transformation was meant to unfold. This was no clean, sterile, modern lab. This was a place of organized chaos, a physical manifestation of a mind grappling with the mysteries of the universe. It was a space that was part workshop, part temple, and part lunatic asylum. The air itself would be thick and heavy, a potent cocktail of smells, the sharp, acrid bite of mineral acids, the sweet, cloying scent of distilling herbs, the metallic tang of heated mercury, and the ever-present stink of sulfur, the traditional scent of the devil, which here was seen as a key to divine secrets. The heart of the laboratory was the Athanor, a tall, slow-burning furnace designed to maintain a constant, gentle heat for weeks, months, or even years on end. Alchemists believed that the transformation of metals was a natural process that happened deep within the earth, a slow ripening of base metals into gold over millennia. The Athanor was their artificial womb, a device designed to accelerate this natural process, to coax nature into revealing its secrets ahead of schedule. On and around it would be a bewildering array of glassware, each piece with a specific, almost mystical, purpose. There were the alembics for distillation, the pelicans with their curved necks, designed to endlessly cycle vapor, and the retorts for heating substances to extreme temperatures. But the most important vessel was the philosopher's egg, a sealed glass container, often egg-shaped, in which the initial raw materials, the prima materia, were placed. This was the crucible of creation itself, a microcosm of the universe, where the entire transformative process would take place under the alchemist's watchful eye. But this wasn't just about equipment. The laboratory was a library of the forbidden, a landscape of symbols. The walls would be covered, not with chemical formulas, but with cryptic charts and diagrams. You'd see astrological tables, linking the 7 known metals of the ancient world to the 7 celestial bodies: gold to the sun, silver to the moon, iron to Mars, mercury to Mercury, tin to Jupiter, copper to Venus, and lead to Saturn. This wasn't just quaint symbolism. It was a core belief. Alchemists held that the cosmos was a single, interconnected organism. The events in the heavens directly influenced the processes on Earth. A successful experiment had to be timed to the correct planetary alignment. To begin a distillation, when Mars was in ascendant, was to invite aggression and failure into your work. It was a delicate cosmic dance, and one wrong step could ruin everything. The imagery was everywhere. A secret language for the initiated. You'd see drawings of the Ouroboros, a snake eating its own tail, representing the cyclical nature of life, death, and rebirth. There were images of the green lion devouring the sun, a symbol for the process of using a powerful solvent like aqua regia to dissolve gold. You'd see the red king and the white queen, personifications of sulfur and mercury, engaged in a mystical marriage. Their union meant to produce the philosopher's stone. These weren't just illustrations. They were coded instructions, allegorical recipes that concealed their true meaning from the unworthy and the uninitiated. To read an alchemical text was not to read a scientific paper. It was to decipher a poem, a myth, a riddle wrapped in an enigma. The ingredients themselves were spoken of in this same coded language. Dragon's blood might refer to cinnabar, eagle's bile to ammonia, wolf's spittle to antimony. It was a deliberate veil of secrecy, designed to protect their sacred knowledge from the profane, and not coincidentally, from the prying eyes of the church, which often viewed their work with deep suspicion, seeing it as a dangerous trespass into God's domain. The alchemist's lab was a place where science, magic, art, and religion bled into one another, a messy, beautiful, and profoundly strange space where humanity tried to grab the livers of creation and pull. At the very heart of the alchemical quest lay a single, all-consuming concept known as the Great Work, or the magnum opus. This wasn't just a series of chemical experiments. It was a spiritual and philosophical journey, a grand, overarching project to mimic and accelerate the creative process of the universe itself. The alchemists believed that all matter originated from a single, undifferentiated substance, the prima materia, or first matter. This was the chaotic, formless stuff of potential that existed before the world was given its shape. They believed that this substance was still present, hidden within all things, and that if they could isolate it, they could begin the work of creation anew. The great work was the process of taking this raw, imperfect matter, often symbolized by a base metal like lead, and guiding it through a series of transformative stages until it reached its final, perfected state, the philosopher's stone. This was seen as a mirror of the human soul's journey. Just as lead was the lowest, dullest of metals, so too was the ordinary human soul, weighed down by sin, ignorance, and mortality. By purifying the lead, the alchemist believed he was simultaneously purifying himself. The laboratory was his soul, the experiment his spiritual discipline. Each stage of the work corresponded to a stage of inner transformation. Traditionally, the great work was divided into 4, and later 3, major stages, each identified by a specific color that would appear in the philosopher's egg. The first stage was the nigredo, or the blackening. This was a process of putrefaction and decomposition. The alchemist would take his raw materials, seal them in the vessel, and heat them until they broke down into a uniform, black sludge. This stage represented death, chaos, the dark night of the soul. It was a necessary descent into darkness, a confrontation with one's own mortality and shadow. It was the symbolic death of the old self, a complete dissolution before anything new could be born. Many alchemists failed at this stage, either through impatience or a failure of the spirit. It was the hardest, most despairing part of the journey. If the alchemist persevered, the black mass would eventually give way to the second stage, the albedo or the whitening. As the heating continued, the blackness would begin to lighten, eventually transforming into a brilliant, shining white substance, often compared to silver or the full moon. This represented purification, washing away the filth of the nigredo. It was the stage of spiritual enlightenment, the baptism of the soul. The old, corrupt self had been burned away, and a new, purified consciousness was beginning to emerge. This was a moment of great hope and celebration, a sign that the alchemist was on the right path. Following the albedo came the citrinitas, or the yellowing. This was a transitional stage, often later subsumed into the final one, representing the dawning of the light, the sunrise after the moonlit night of the albedo. The white substance would begin to take on a golden or yellow hue, a sign that the final perfection was approaching. It symbolized the rising of the philosophical sun, the moment when divine wisdom began to illuminate the purified soul. Finally, the great work would culminate in the roubeau, or the reddening. The substance in the vessel would transform from yellow into a deep, vibrant red or purple, the color of royalty, of blood, and of the rising sun. This was the moment of triumph. The alchemist had successfully created the philosopher's stone, a substance of immense power, said to be a dense, ruby-red powder or glass. This final stage represented the union of opposites, of body and spirit, of matter and mind, of the Red King and the White Queen. It was spiritual rebirth, resurrection, the attainment of a divine state. The alchemist had not just made a magical substance. He had, in his own view, become a new kind of being, a master of the material world and his own soul, an adept who now understood the language of creation. The great work was nothing less than a recipe for becoming godlike, a step-by-step guide to escaping the mortal coil and achieving perfection on earth. Of course, for every devout philosopher-alchemist, patiently tending his furnace in a quest for spiritual enlightenment, there were at least a dozen hustlers who saw the great work not as a path to perfection, but as the perfect scam. Alchemy, with its secret languages, its promise of infinite wealth, and its reliance on processes that few could understand, was a field ripe for exploitation. And the most tempting targets of all were the people with the most to gain and the most to lose, the kings, queens, and nobles of Europe. Imagine you're a Renaissance prince. Your treasury is perpetually empty, thanks to a series of expensive wars, a taste for lavish parties, and a cripplingly inefficient tax system. Then, a mysterious man appears at your court. He's cloaked in an aura of ancient wisdom, speaks in riddles, and carries with him a collection of impressive-looking glass contraptions. He whispers in your ear of a secret he has uncovered, a method for transmuting worthless lead into pure, shimmering gold. All he needs, he explains, is a well-equipped laboratory, a steady supply of materials, mercury, sulfur, and a few other more exotic ingredients, and of course a generous stipend to support him during the delicate and time-consuming process. For a desperate ruler, the offer was almost impossible to resist. It was the medieval equivalent of being offered the password to the global banking system. And so, the royal courts of Europe became a revolving door for alchemical con artists. These men were masters of spectacle and sleight of hand. They would put on dazzling demonstrations for their patrons, using a variety of clever tricks to prove their abilities. A favorite was the hollow stirring rod. The charlatan would pack the rod with gold dust and seal the end with wax. When he stirred a crucible of bubbling molten lead, the wax would melt, releasing the gold into the mixture. When the concoction cooled, a small but very real nugget of gold would be found at the bottom. The court would gasp in amazement, and the prince, his eyes wide with greed, would immediately sign over another bag of coins to fund the next larger-scale experiment. Another popular trick involved using a crucible with a false bottom. The lower compartment would be preloaded with gold or silver, hidden beneath a layer of powdered charcoal. The alchemist would then dramatically throw in a lump of lead, add a pinch of his miraculous red powder, the supposed philosopher's stone, and heat the vessel. The lead would melt and drain away through a hidden hole, or the charcoal layer would burn off, revealing the precious metal that had been there all along. It was pure theater, a magic show where the stakes were the entire wealth of a kingdom. Some of these con men became legends in their own right. One of the most famous was the enigmatic figure known as Edward Kelly, the associate of the brilliant Elizabethan mathematician and occultist John Dee. While Dee was a genuine scholar, obsessed with communicating with angels, Kelly was a far more dubious character. He was a scryer, claiming to see visions in a crystal ball, but he also had a reputation as a forger and had famously had his ears cropped as punishment for a previous crime. Together, they traveled to the court of Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II in Prague, a known fanatic of the occult arts. Kelly claimed to possess the philosopher's stone and performed several seemingly successful transmutations, dazzling the emperor and securing a place of immense power and influence at his court. For a time, Kelly lived like a king, knighted and granted vast estates. But the pressure to produce gold on an industrial scale was immense. When he inevitably failed to deliver, the emperor's patience wore thin. Kelly was imprisoned, and he died trying to escape from a castle window. His story was a cautionary tale, a perfect encapsulation of the alchemist's precarious position. One moment you're a revered sage with the ear of the king, the next you're a prisoner in a dungeon, your promises having turned to dust just as surely as the lead in your crucible. These court alchemists were gamblers playing the most dangerous game in the world, and for everyone who managed to slip away with a fortune, another ended their career on the gallows, a grim final payment for a debt of gold they could never repay. But while the charlatans were busy fleecing dukes, and the philosophers were chasing spiritual perfection, something else was happening in those smoky, cluttered laboratories. Almost entirely by accident, the alchemists were stumbling upon the foundations of modern science. In their relentless, often misguided, quest to unlock the secrets of transmutation, they were developing the tools, techniques, and materials that would one day give birth to the field of chemistry. They were the unwitting pioneers of the scientific revolution, mapping a new continent while convinced they were sailing to Eden. Think about the sheer practical knowledge they had to accumulate. In order to purify their materials for the great work, they became masters of distillation. They invented and refined the alembic, creating increasingly complex setups to separate liquids with different boiling points. This wasn't just for making moonshine. It was the technique that would later allow for the production of everything from perfumes to industrial chemicals. They perfected methods of crystallization, sublimation, and filtration, all fundamental processes that are still taught in chemistry 101 today. They were the world's first true experimentalists, working not just from ancient texts, but through trial and error, meticulously observing, recording, and more often than not, blowing things up. Their obsessive experimentation with minerals and metals led them to discover and isolate a host of new substances. The German alchemist Hennig Brand, in 1669, was on a particularly bizarre quest. Convinced that the golden color of urine meant it contained the essence of life, and therefore gold, he decided to distill it. He reportedly boiled down some 1,500 gallons of the stuff, a truly heroic and nose-searing endeavor. What he got wasn't gold. It was something far stranger and more wonderful, a waxy, white substance that in the dark glowed with an eerie, ethereal light. He had discovered the element phosphorus, the light bearer. He had no idea what it was, but he knew it was something new under the sun. Similarly, alchemists were the first to prepare and describe powerful mineral acids like sulfuric acid, which they called oil of vitriol, nitric acid, aqua fortis, and hydrochloric acid. The combination of nitric and hydrochloric acids created aqua regia, the royal water, a substance so corrosive it could dissolve even gold, the king of metals. This was a monumental breakthrough. For the first time, humans could break down the most stable substance they knew, a power that must have felt truly godlike. They weren't just discovering new things, they were also creating a language and a framework for understanding them. While their symbols were mystical, their attempts to classify substances based on their properties, their color, their weight, their reaction to heat, were the first baby steps toward a systematic chemistry. They laid the groundwork for the concept of chemical analysis, and in their belief that all matter was composed of a few fundamental principles like salt, sulfur, and mercury, in the system of the famous alchemist Paracelsus, they were wrestling with the same fundamental question that drives chemistry today. What is the world made of? Paracelsus himself represents a crucial bridge between alchemy and modern medicine. He famously declared that the dose makes the poison, a foundational principle of toxicology. He rejected the idea that alchemy was only about making gold, and argued that its true purpose was to create medicines. He pioneered the use of chemically prepared tinctures and mineral-based drugs, creating remedies from substances like mercury, arsenic, and antimony. While many of his treatments were undoubtedly toxic and dangerous, he was pushing the world away from purely herbal remedies and toward a new field, electrochemistry, or chemical medicine. He was, in essence, the grandfather of pharmacology. The alchemists' legacy, then, is a paradox. They were searching for a mythical substance that could perfect the world, and in doing so, they gave the world the practical tools to actually understand and manipulate it. They were looking for magic and found science instead. The sun began to set on the age of alchemy during the Enlightenment of the 17th and 18th centuries. A new kind of thinking was taking hold across Europe, a worldview built on reason, empirical evidence, and mathematical precision. The mystical, allegorical language of the alchemists began to look less like profound wisdom and more like obscurantist nonsense to a new generation of thinkers who called themselves natural philosophers and later scientists. The great work was being replaced by a greater one, the systematic, rational investigation of the material world. The turning point can arguably be traced to one man, Robert Boyle. In his 1661 book, The Sceptical Chymist, Boyle took a sledgehammer to the foundations of alchemical theory. He attacked the classical Greek idea of four elements: earth, air, fire, water, and the alchemical trio of principles: salt, sulfur, mercury. Instead, he proposed a new modern definition of a chemical element, a substance that could not be broken down into simpler substances by chemical means. This was a radical, revolutionary idea. It shifted the entire goal of the field. The new chemistry was no longer about transmuting one thing into another, based on its spiritual properties. It was about analysis, about breaking substances down to their irreducible components and understanding how those components combined. Boyle advocated for a science based on repeatable experiments, precise measurements, and the open sharing of knowledge, the polar opposite of the secretive, coded world of alchemy. The final nail in the coffin was hammered in by Antoine Lavoisier, the father of modern chemistry in the late 18th century. Through his meticulous experiments with combustion, Lavoisier established the law of conservation of mass, proving that matter is neither created nor destroyed in a chemical reaction. He also definitively identified oxygen and explained its role in combustion and respiration. His work demonstrated that chemical transformations were not mystical processes, but predictable, quantifiable reactions between distinct elements. There was no room in Lavoisier's ordered, balanced equations for the green lion or the red king. He had replaced the alchemist's allegorical poetry with the cold, hard grammar of mathematics. Transmutation wasn't just difficult. It was, according to the new laws of chemistry, impossible. Lead was lead and gold was gold because their fundamental, unchangeable elements were different. The dream was officially dead. And yet, did alchemy really die? Or did it simply transmute? While its practice as a science faded into obscurity, its spirit, its ambition, and its symbolism proved to be remarkably resilient. It went underground, its ideas absorbed into the bloodstream of Western culture. The esoteric and mystical traditions, like Rosicrucianism and Freemasonry, continued to use alchemical allegory as a framework for spiritual development. The great work was no longer about a physical substance. It was a purely internal, psychological process of self-perfection. This idea was most famously revived in the 20th century by the psychoanalyst Carl Jung. Jung saw the bizarre, dreamlike imagery of alchemy not as failed chemistry, but as a roadmap of the human psyche. He believed the alchemists, in their sealed vessels, had unknowingly projected their own unconscious processes onto matter. The nigredo was the confrontation with the personal shadow. The union of the Red King and White Queen was the integration of the animus and anima. The philosopher's stone was the symbol of the fully realized, individuated self. For Jung, alchemy was a lost chapter in the history of psychology, a profound exploration of the human soul disguised as a laboratory science. And of course, alchemy is alive and well in our popular culture. It's the engine that drives countless fantasy stories, from the quest for the Sorcerer's Stone in Harry Potter to the complex lore of video games and anime. We are still captivated by its core promise, the idea of transformation, of turning the base and worthless into the precious and powerful. It speaks to a deep human hope that we are not fixed, that we can be improved, that we can, through some secret knowledge or great effort, become something more than we are. In a strange twist of fate, alchemy failed in its literal goal, but it succeeded spectacularly in its metaphorical one. It never managed to turn lead into gold, but it did create something far more enduring, a powerful and timeless myth of transformation that continues to glow in the dark corners of our collective imagination. All right, tonight we're setting aside the dusty laboratories and solemn histories for something a little different. We're diving headfirst into a life so flamboyant, so utterly defiant of convention, that it feels less like a historical account and more like the plot of a swashbuckling rock opera. We're talking about a woman who was a sword-wielding, tavern-brawling, opera-singing, convent-burning bisexual icon, all before the end of the 17th century. She was a walking, talking scandal, a duelist with a soprano's voice, a force of nature who lived by a simple code: if you want something, take it. If someone gets in your way, run them through. This is the story of Julie de Aubigny, better known to history as Mademoiselle de Maupin. Her life was a blur of passion, violence, and high art, a chaotic masterpiece painted on the canvas of Baroque France. She was tried and sentenced to death in absentia, pardoned by the King of France not once, but twice, and became one of the biggest stars of the Paris Opera. She seduced men and women with equal abandon, fought duels over lovers, and generally treated the laws of God and man as gentle suggestions to be ignored. Her story is a potent reminder that history isn't always made by stoic generals and calculating politicians. Sometimes it's shaped by individuals so unapologetically themselves that they tear a hole in the fabric of their own time. So pour yourself a glass of something strong, because this is not your typical bedtime story. This is the legend of the she-devil with the voice of an angel. Julie d'Aubigny was born into a world of contradictions, a place of exquisite refinement and brutal reality. She came into the world around 1673, her cradle rocked by the rhythm of life at the court of King Louis XIV, the Sun King. Her father, Gaston d'Aubigny, was no great nobleman, but he had a position of immense influence and proximity to power. He was the secretary to the Count of Armagnac, the king's grand squire. This meant he worked at the grand stables of the Tuileries Palace, the nerve center of the court's equestrian life, a place where the finest horses and the most skilled horsemen in France were trained. It was a world of disciplined grace, aristocratic privilege, and raw masculine energy. And it was in this world, not in a convent or a drawing room, that Julie's extraordinary character was forged. From the very beginning, it was clear that Julie was not destined for the traditional path of a 17th century woman. That path was a narrow one. A convent education focused on piety and domestic arts, followed by an arranged marriage designed to secure a family alliance, and then a life of quiet obedience, producing heirs and managing a household. Gaston d'Aubigny, for reasons history doesn't fully explain. Perhaps he saw a spark in his daughter. Perhaps he was simply an eccentric, decided to throw that entire script into the fire. Instead of teaching her embroidery and etiquette, he raised her like a son. She received the same education as the court pages, the young boys of noble birth who served the grand squire. This was a curriculum designed to produce gentlemen, warriors, and courtiers. While other girls were learning to curtsy, Julie was learning to read, to draw, to dance, and most importantly, to fight. She trained in the art of fencing alongside the boys, learning the deadly ballet of the rapier from the finest masters in the kingdom. She learned to ride a horse not side-saddle, but astride like a man, mastering the powerful animals with a fearless confidence. She was, in essence, being given all the tools of masculine power and privilege, a social and educational experiment that was almost unheard of for a woman of her time. This upbringing had a profound effect on her. It instilled in her a fierce independence and a complete disregard for the gendered expectations of her society. She learned to think, act, and fight like a man, and she saw no reason why she should be denied the freedoms that men took for granted. The court was her playground, and she moved through it with a swagger and a self-assurance that was both dazzling and deeply unsettling to the established order. She was beautiful, witty, and armed. It was a dangerous combination. Naturally, a woman like this was not going to settle into a quiet, conventional marriage. As she entered her teenage years, her passions became as sharp and untamed as her sword skills. She took a lover who happened to be her father's boss, the Count of Armagnac himself. This was a classic courtly affair, a well-trodden path of ambition and romance. Her father, ever the pragmatist, saw an opportunity to cover up the scandal and give his daughter a respectable social standing. He quickly arranged a marriage for her to a mild-mannered gentleman, the Sieur de Maupin from Saint-Germain-en-Laye. Julie went through with the wedding, acquired a new respectable name, and then promptly ignored her husband. The poor man was given a provincial administrative post and packed off to the south of France, while his firebrand of a wife stayed behind in Paris to continue her affair and her adventures. She was now Madame de Maupin in name, but in spirit she was still Julie d'Aubigny, a swordswoman, in a world that expected her to be a doll. The stage was set, the fuse was lit, and her life of quiet rebellion was about to explode into open warfare against the entire world. Paris, even under the glittering reign of the Sun King, couldn't contain a spirit as volatile as Julie d'Aubigny's for long. Her affair with the Count of Armagnac inevitably cooled, and her restless energy demanded a new stage, a new adventure. She found it in the arms of a man named Saranas, a fencing master and a notorious duelist. This was not a relationship of courtly intrigue. It was a collision of two equally fiery, equally reckless souls, and it was this relationship that would catapult her from a court curiosity into a wanted criminal. The problem was that dueling, while still a deeply ingrained part of the aristocratic honor code, had been officially outlawed by the king. Louis XIV was a monarch obsessed with order and control, and the idea of his noblemen killing each other over petty insults was an affront to his absolute authority. Edicts were passed, and the punishments were severe, often including death. Saranas, being a man who treated royal edicts like minor inconveniences, found himself in hot water after killing a man in an illegal duel. With a warrant out for his arrest, he had no choice but to flee Paris, and Julie, never one to miss an opportunity for chaos and romance, went with him. They hit the road, heading south towards Marseille. But they weren't your typical fugitive couple living in fear. They turned their escape into a traveling roadshow of swordplay and spectacle. To make a living, they put on public fencing exhibitions in taverns and at country fairs. This was where Julie's unconventional upbringing truly paid off. She would often perform dressed as a man, a disguise that added a layer of theatrical mystery to their act. The sight of this slender, agile youth, matching a seasoned master like Saranas blow for blow, was enough to draw a crowd. But the real showstopper was the reveal. The stories, likely embellished, but rooted in truth, paint a vivid picture. A local hothead in the crowd, perhaps drunk on wine and arrogance, would doubt the skill of the young fencer, or question whether he was a man at all. Julie, with a flair for the dramatic, would accept the challenge. A duel would be arranged. She would toy with her opponent, parrying his clumsy lunges with effortless grace before disarming him with a flick of her wrist. Then, for the grand finale, she would rip open her shirt, exposing her breasts to the stunned and silent crowd. It was the ultimate mic drop, a defiant gesture that simultaneously proved her skill, revealed her identity, and humiliated her opponent in the most spectacular fashion possible. It was pure, unadulterated. Julie d'Aubigny, brilliant, audacious, and utterly scandalous. Their journey was a picaresque adventure, a string of duels, performances, and narrow escapes. But somewhere along the road to Marseille, Julie discovered another talent, one that was perhaps even more remarkable than her skill with a sword. She discovered she could sing. She had a naturally powerful and beautiful voice, a rich contralto. This talent, combined with her innate stage presence, was her ticket to a new world. Seeing an opportunity for a more stable and perhaps more glorious career than street fighting, she and Saranas parted ways. She joined a provincial opera company run by a man named Gautier de Marseille. This was a world away from the gilded cages of the royal court. The life of a traveling opera singer was rough, nomadic, and often disreputable. But for Julie, it was freedom. She could live as she pleased, earn her own money, and be celebrated for her talent. She quickly became a popular performer, her voice and her fiery personality captivating audiences across the south of France. She was no longer just the rebellious daughter of a court official or the mistress of a nobleman. She was La Maupine, a rising star. But this new life of artistic expression did nothing to tame her wild heart. In fact, it was in Marseille that she would embark on the most infamous, most outrageously romantic, and most criminally insane adventure of her entire life, an episode that would involve a beautiful girl, a convent, a corpse, and a whole lot of fire. It was in Marseille, amidst the heady world of provincial opera, that Julie d'Aubigny's already chaotic life took a turn into the realm of pure pyromaniacal legend. Her passions had always been intense and immediate, but now, free from the constraints of Paris and fueled by the drama of the stage, she fell into a love affair that would make all her previous entanglements look like polite tea parties. The object of her affection was a young woman, the beautiful daughter of a local merchant. Their romance was, by all accounts, a whirlwind of clandestine meetings and breathless passion. It was everything a grand, tragic opera should be, and Julie was determined to be its star. The girl's family, however, was less than thrilled with this arrangement. Discovering that their precious daughter was involved in a scandalous same-sex relationship with a notorious sword-fighting opera singer was, to put it mildly, not part of their life plan for her. In the 17th century, the standard response to a rebellious daughter was swift, severe, and designed for maximum spiritual correction. They did what wealthy, horrified parents did. They packed the girl off to a convent, specifically the convent of the Visitandines in Avignon, a place of high walls, strict rules, and theoretically no escape. For them, the matter was settled. They had locked their problem away, entrusting her soul to God and her body to the care of the nuns. They had severely, catastrophically underestimated Julie d'Aubigny. For Julie, the convent walls were not a solution. They were a declaration of war. The idea of her lover being imprisoned, forced into a life of piety against her will, was an intolerable affront. A normal person might have written letters, pleaded with the family, or simply moved on. Julie decided on a course of action that was decidedly not normal. Her plan was audacious, theatrical, and so unbelievably reckless, it still beggars belief. She wasn't just going to break her lover out. She was going to stage a jailbreak, so spectacular it would be talked about for centuries. First, she needed to get inside. Using her considerable charm and a fabricated story of wanting to renounce her worldly ways, she convinced the nuns to accept her as a novice. She took the vows, donned the habit, and entered the very convent that held her beloved captive. She was now a wolf in the sheepfold, a stick of dynamite in a house of prayer. For weeks, she played the part of a pious, penitent young woman, all while secretly planning her next move. Her moment came when an elderly nun in the convent passed away from natural causes. The nuns, following their custom, placed the body in the chapel to lie in state before burial the next day. This was the linchpin of Julie's insane plan. That night, under the cover of darkness, she crept into the chapel. With the help of her lover, she dragged the deceased nun's body from its bier and hauled it to her lover's cell. They placed the corpse in the girl's bed, arranged it to look like a sleeping figure, and then, for the grand finale, they set the entire room on fire. As smoke and flames began to billow from the cell, chaos erupted. The nuns, awakened by the fire and the screams, scrambled to put out the blaze. In the ensuing panic and confusion, Julie and her lover simply walked out the front gate, unnoticed. They had done it. They had escaped. Behind them, they left a smoldering room, and what everyone assumed was the tragically burned body of the merchant's daughter, a victim of a terrible accident. It was a plan of such breathtaking, sociopathic brilliance that it almost worked. They fled, enjoying a few months of freedom and passionate reunion. But the authorities were not as easily fooled as the nuns. When the fire was investigated, and the details of the accident didn't quite add up, the truth began to emerge. The law, which at this time was heavily influenced by the church, came down on them with the force of a divine thunderbolt. The charges were kidnapping, body snatching, arson of a holy place, and sacrilege. The verdict was delivered in absentia, as Julie and her lover were long gone. The sentence for Julie de Aubigny, also known as La Maupin, was death by fire. She was to be burned at the stake, the traditional punishment for the most heinous crimes against God and the state. At an age when most young women were settling into domestic life, Julie de Aubigny was a wanted fugitive with a death sentence hanging over her head, all for the sake of love and a good story. Being a condemned criminal on the run would, for most people, be a cue to lie low, adopt a new identity, and perhaps take up a quiet life of shepherding in a remote village. For Julie d'Aubigny, it was merely an inconvenient administrative hurdle with a death sentence to her name. She did what she always did when faced with an obstacle. She headed straight for the heart of the storm, back towards Paris, the one place where power, art, and influence could potentially save her from the flames. Her journey back north was, as usual, anything but quiet. One apocryphal but wonderfully characteristic story from this period has her running into a handsome young nobleman, the Comte d'Albert. After a drunken argument, he insulted her. She challenged him to a duel, and she promptly ran him through the shoulder. Seeing him wounded, her fury instantly evaporated, replaced by a strange sense of responsibility. She took him back to his inn, nursed him back to health, and in the process, they became lovers. After he recovered, they continued their affair for a time, before parting as amicable friends. It was classic Julie: violence, passion, and a complete disregard for predictable human behavior, all wrapped up in one chaotic package. Upon reaching Paris, she didn't hide in the shadows. She sought out her old flame and patron, the powerful Count of Armagnac. She needed his help, and she knew exactly how to get it. She appealed to him, likely using a combination of her formidable charm, their shared history, and a compelling argument that her talents were too valuable to be wasted on a bonfire. The Count, still influential at the court of Louis XIV, went to work. He pleaded her case directly to the king, framing her actions not as heinous crimes, but as the foolish, passionate indiscretions of youth. Miraculously, it worked. The Sun King, perhaps amused by the sheer audacity of her story, granted her a royal pardon. Just like that, her death sentence was wiped away. She was free. And what does one do after being saved from being burned at the stake for burning down a convent? If you're Julie de Aubigny, you audition for the most prestigious and demanding artistic institution in the country, the Paris Opera. Founded by the king himself, the Académie Royale de Musique was the pinnacle of the French musical world. It was a place of immense prestige, rigorous standards, and cutthroat competition. In 1690, Julie, armed with her royal pardon and her raw, powerful voice, presented herself to the opera's gatekeepers. Her audition was the stuff of legend. Initially, the musicians were skeptical, but when she opened her mouth to sing, any doubts were silenced. Her voice, untrained but naturally magnificent, filled the room. She was hired on the spot. She made her debut in a production of Cadmus et Hermione by Jean-Baptiste Lully, the court's official composer. She was an instant sensation. The Parisian public was utterly captivated. She had a stage presence that was electric, a raw, untamed energy that was unlike anything the formal, mannered world of French opera had ever seen. She wasn't just a singer, she was a phenomenon. Over the next decade and a half, she would become one of the opera's biggest stars, celebrated for her vocal talent and her dramatic interpretations. She originated roles in new operas and was praised for her ability to convey deep emotion. She had found a place where her larger-than-life personality was not a liability, but an asset. On stage, she could be a queen, a goddess, a sorceress. She could channel all of her passion, her fury, and her love into her performance, and the audience adored her for it. But the discipline of the stage did little to temper the chaos of her personal life. The woman who captivated Paris by night was the same woman who terrorized it by day. Her off-stage antics were just as famous as her on-stage arias, ensuring that La Maupine was a name constantly on the lips of every gossip in the city. Becoming a celebrated diva of the Paris Opera did absolutely nothing to domesticate Julie d'Aubigny. If anything, her fame and fortune only gave her a larger stage for her personal brand of chaos. She was now a public figure, a celebrity in a city that adored scandal, and she provided it in spades. Her life offstage was a constant whirlwind of duels, love affairs, and public altercations that kept the gossip mills of Paris running at full capacity. She was the 17th century equivalent of a rock star, and she lived the part to the fullest. Her temper was legendary, and her skill with a sword was no secret. Dueling was still illegal, but that was a minor detail she chose to ignore. She would fight anyone, anywhere, for any reason. One evening, she was accosted by a trio of noblemen who made the fatal mistake of insulting her. She coolly suggested they take their disagreement outside. One by one, in the darkened square outside the theater, she dueled and wounded all three of them. The incident became the talk of Paris, a story that only enhanced her terrifying and glamorous reputation. She was not a woman to be trifled with, and everyone knew it. Her love life was equally tumultuous and unapologetically public. She continued to have affairs with both men and women, often simultaneously. She had a passionate and reportedly violent relationship with a fellow singer, Fanchon Moreau, who was as famous for her beauty as La Maupine was for her voice. But her most significant male lover during this period was the Marquis de Danchat. Their relationship was a long-running saga of passion, jealousy, and very public fights. Yet, it was one of her most enduring connections. Perhaps the single most famous, most utterly Maupin incident of her career took place at a lavish ball hosted by a member of the royal family. Julie arrived, as she often did, dressed in men's clothing. She spent the evening charming and dancing with a beautiful young debutante, much to the annoyance of several of the young lady's male suitors. After a particularly intimate dance, Julie led the girl into a quiet corner and kissed her passionately. The girl's three would-be lovers, outraged, confronted Julie. She calmly replied, "Come, all of you," and led them out into the garden. As the ball continued inside, Julie d'Aubigny, still in her elegant male attire, fought a 3-on-1 sword fight, and according to the legend, defeated all of them. She then strolled back into the ballroom, found her host, and explained that she had just fought 3 of his guests, and felt it might be best if she departed. This incident, however, was a step too far, even for her. Dueling on royal property during a court function was a grave offense against the king's authority. Once again, she was forced to flee Paris, and once again, a warrant was issued for her arrest. And once again, through the intervention of powerful friends who argued that the opera simply could not function without its greatest star. She received her second royal pardon. She was, it seemed, too entertaining for the king to execute. She returned to the opera in triumph, her legend now bordering on the mythological. She was more popular than ever, but a life lived at such a fever pitch cannot be sustained forever. The constant drama, the fighting, the drinking, the intense emotional highs and lows began to take their toll. Around 1705, at the height of her fame, and still in her early 30s, she did something that shocked everyone more than any duel or scandal ever had. She retired. She walked away from the stage, from the applause, from the city that was her playground. The great star of the Paris Opera simply vanished from public life. The flames that had burned so brightly and so fiercely for so long were beginning to dim. The final act of her incredible life would be the quietest and perhaps the most surprising of all. Tonight we're heading west. We're journeying back to a time when a single word could ignite a nation, a word that promised to erase the past, rewrite the future, and solve every problem with a glint of yellow in a muddy riverbed. That word, of course, was gold. We all dream of it in one form or another. We call it financial freedom, early retirement, or winning the lottery. It's the age-old human fantasy of the great shortcut, the one lucky break that will catapult us from a life of toil to a life of ease. We daydream about what we would do, who we would become if we suddenly struck it rich. But what happens when that daydream becomes a national obsession? What happens when an entire country, from its farmers and shopkeepers to its politicians and preachers, collectively loses its mind and stampedes towards a single glittering promise? In 1848, that fantasy became a reality in a remote, half-forgotten territory that had just been pried away from Mexico. The California Gold Rush wasn't just a historical event. It was a mass psychological experiment. It was a test of what happens when you remove the rules, strip away the structures of society, and offer ordinary people a chance at unimaginable wealth, with the only price being their comfort, their safety, and quite often, their souls. This is the story of how a few shiny pebbles in a riverbed built an empire, shattered countless lives, and exposed the raw, brutal, and occasionally glorious heart of the American dream. It all began on a quiet, damp morning on January 24th, 1848. Not with a bang, but with a flicker. The location was Sutter's Mill, a new sawmill being constructed on the South Fork of the American River in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains. The land belonged to John Sutter, an ambitious and slightly delusional Swiss immigrant who had convinced the Mexican government to grant him a vast 50,000-acre tract of land he called New Helvetia. He dreamed of building a private agricultural empire, a feudal kingdom in the California wilderness. He was a man of grand visions, but the one that was about to unfold was beyond even his wildest imagination. The man who actually saw the flicker was James W. Marshall, a quiet, moody carpenter from New Jersey, whom Sutter had hired to oversee the mill's construction. On that fateful morning, Marshall was inspecting the tail race, the channel that carried water away from the mill's water wheel. He had deepened it to increase the water flow, and as the morning sun hit the churning water, something caught his eye. There in the muddy gravel were a few small gleaming flakes. They weren't like the shiny, deceptive glint of mica or fool's gold. This was something different. It had a heft, a weight, a soft, buttery luster that felt ancient and important. His heart began to pound. He gathered a few of the flakes, tucked them into his pouch, and knew with a certainty that was both thrilling and terrifying, that his life had just changed forever. Marshall rode the 50 miles back to Sutter's Fort, the administrative center of the colony, in a state of feverish excitement. He burst into Sutter's office, demanded the room be locked, and dramatically unwrapped his discovery on the table. The two men conducted a series of crude, frantic tests. They hammered a nugget. It didn't break, but flattened, a key characteristic of gold. They dropped it in nitric acid. It didn't corrode. They consulted an encyclopedia. There could be no doubt it was gold, pure, unadulterated, world-changing gold. Sutter's reaction was not one of pure joy. It was one of pure panic. He was an empire builder, a man of order and agriculture. He understood instantly that a gold rush would destroy everything he had worked for. Who would plant his crops, tend his herds, or finish his mill when they could be picking up fortunes from the ground? He tried to swear Marshall and his workers to secrecy. He even tried to secure the mineral rights to the land from the local Native American tribes and the U.S. military government. It was a futile gesture, like trying to cup a tsunami in your hands. A secret this big, this potent, could not be contained. The information didn't explode into the world. It leaked. A worker from the mill, drunk on whiskey and excitement, paid for a bottle at a local store using a pinch of gold dust. A Mormon elder, Samuel Brannan, who ran a store near Sutter's Fort, saw the bigger picture. He quickly and quietly bought up every shovel, pickaxe, and pan he could find in the region. Then, once he was fully stocked, he became the secret's greatest evangelist. In May of 1848, he ran through the dusty streets of San Francisco, a tiny port town with a few hundred residents, holding a vial of gold dust high in the air and shouting, "Gold, gold, gold from the American River." The fire had been lit. Brannan, incidentally, would become California's first millionaire, not by mining gold, but by selling overpriced supplies to the miners. He understood the first and most important rule of a gold rush. The surest way to get rich is to sell the shovels. The secret was out, and an entire world was about to come crashing down on John Sutter's quiet little empire. The news of gold spread at the speed of a 19th century rumor, which is to say, slowly at first, and then all at once. Initially, it was a local phenomenon. The men working for Sutter abandoned their posts overnight. Farmhands dropped their plows. Sailors jumped ship in San Francisco Bay. Soldiers deserted their garrisons. The entire male population of Northern California, it seemed, downed tools and headed for the hills, armed with little more than a tin pan and a wild, desperate hope. The first wave of miners had the hills to themselves, and the stories that trickled back to the coastal towns sounded like pure fantasy. Men were supposedly picking up nuggets the size of their fists. A single person could pan hundreds, even thousands of dollars worth of gold in a single day, at a time when the average laborer on the East Coast made less than $1 a day. For months, the rest of the United States, and indeed the world, remained blissfully unaware. California was a remote, almost mythical place, and communication was slow and unreliable. But in December of 1848, the spark hit the powder keg. In his final address to Congress, President James K. Polk, looking to justify the recent and controversial Mexican-American War, officially confirmed the discovery. He spoke of accounts of gold fields more extensive and valuable than was anticipated, a dry, political understatement that would have seismic consequences. Government even put a sample of the California gold on display at the War Department. It was now official. It was real. The dam of skepticism broke, and a flood of humanity was unleashed. They became known as the 49 Heirs, the men who, in the year 1849, embarked on one of the largest mass migrations in American history. They came from every state in the Union and from every corner of the globe. They were farmers from Missouri, clerks from Boston, doctors from Philadelphia. They were Cornish miners from England, convicts from Australia, peasants from China, laborers from Ireland, and adventurers from Latin America. They were a chaotic, polyglot army of dreamers, all marching towards a single destination. They sold their farms, mortgaged their homes, left their wives and children behind, and gambled everything on a journey that was, in itself, a life or death proposition. For those in the eastern United States, there were three main routes to this new El Dorado, and none of them were easy. The first, and seemingly safest, was the sea route. You could book passage on a ship that would sail all the way around the tip of South America at Cape Horn. It was a brutal 18,000-mile journey that could take anywhere from 5 to 8 months. You would face monstrous storms, mind-numbing boredom, and the constant threat of diseases like scurvy spreading through the cramped, foul-smelling ship. Many vessels were unseaworthy, overloaded with desperate passengers, and captained by men who were little more than opportunistic sailors. A faster, but far more dangerous, sea route involved sailing to Panama, trekking across the 50-mile, disease-ridden isthmus through dense, malaria-infested jungle, and then hoping to catch a second ship on the Pacific side to take you up to San Francisco. The problem was that there were never enough ships on the Pacific coast. Thousands of men found themselves stranded in squalid makeshift camps, slowly dying of cholera, yellow fever, and dysentery, while they waited for a vessel, any vessel, to rescue them from the tropical hell. The third route was the most iconic, the great overland journey across the American continent. This was the stuff of legend, a 2,000-mile trek across prairies, deserts, and mountains. The 49 Heirs would gather in Midwestern staging towns like St. Joseph, Missouri, forming massive wagon trains that would set out in the spring. They faced searing heat on the plains, treacherous river crossings, the constant threat of dehydration, and the looming, snow-capped barrier of the Sierra Nevada. The journey was a race against time. If you didn't make it over the mountains before the first winter snows, you would end up like the infamous Donner Party, trapped and starving. The trail was soon littered with the graves of those who didn't make it, their simple wooden crosses marking the price of their ambition. It's estimated that 1 in 10 who set out on the overland trail never saw California. Their golden road had led them only to an early grave, their dreams buried with them under the vast, indifferent sky. For those who survived the brutal journey, California was not the promised land they had imagined. It was a chaotic, lawless, and utterly unforgiving wilderness. The gold camps that sprang up overnight along the rivers and in the gulches of the Sierra Nevada were not towns. They were temporary agglomerations of human desperation. They had names that perfectly captured their spirit: Hangtown, Rough and Ready, Hell's Half-Acre. These were places built of canvas, rough-hewn logs, and pure, uncut greed. There was no government, no police force, no social structure to speak of. The only law was the one a man could enforce with his own 2 hands, a Bowie knife or a Colt revolver. Life in these camps was a brutal, monotonous grind. The work of mining was back-breaking, soul-crushing labor. A miner would spend 12 to 16 hours a day, standing knee-deep in ice-cold river water, bent over a pan, endlessly swirling mud and gravel in the hope of seeing that telltale yellow glint, where he would work with a rocker, a heavy wooden cradle, that had to be constantly filled and rocked. A two-man job that was a recipe for exhaustion and argument. The physical toll was immense. Men suffered from malnutrition, scurvy, rheumatism, and a host of other ailments brought on by a poor diet, relentless physical labor, and abysmal sanitation. The camps were filthy, the water often contaminated, and diseases like cholera and dysentery swept through the populations like wildfire, killing men faster than any mining accident. The social environment was just as toxic as the physical one. The camps were overwhelmingly male, a society of lonely, frustrated, and heavily armed men, far from their families and any semblance of civilizing influence. The atmosphere was a potent brew of wild optimism and crushing despair. A man could strike it rich one day, finding a pocket of gold that made him a king, and lose it all the next night at the gambling table. Gambling was the primary form of entertainment, a desperate attempt to either accelerate one's fortune or forget one's failure. Tents were set up with makeshift tables where men would wager their hard-won gold dust on games of faro, monte, and poker. Fortunes were won and lost on the turn of a single card. Alcohol was the fuel that kept this engine of desperation running. Saloons, often just a plank of wood laid across two barrels, were the first and most profitable businesses in any new camp. Men drank to celebrate, to mourn, to numb the physical pain, and to kill the mind-numbing boredom. The cheap, potent whiskey flowed freely, and with it came the inevitable violence. Arguments over mining claims, gambling debts, or perceived insults would quickly escalate, from shouting matches to knife fights or gun battles. Life was cheap, and justice was swift and informal. When a crime was committed, a theft, a murder, the miners would often form their own impromptu courts. A miners' court was a form of direct and often brutal democracy. A man would be accused, a jury of whoever was standing around would be assembled, and a verdict would be delivered, often within minutes. Punishments were harsh and designed for immediate effect. A thief might be flogged, have his ears cropped, or be branded with a T on his cheek. For murder or a major theft, the sentence was almost always death by hanging. The nearest sturdy oak tree would serve as a gallows, and the entire camp would turn out to watch. This was not a system of justice. It was a system of order, a crude and violent attempt to impose some set of rules on a world that had none. It was a society stripped down to its most basic elements: hard labor, raw greed, and the constant looming presence of a lonely death far from home. So, with all the hardship, the violence, and the crushing disappointment, who actually got rich in the California gold rush? The answer, for the most part, is almost nobody who was actually digging for gold. The popular image of the grizzled prospector, striking a mother lode and retiring a wealthy man, was for 99% of the 49 years a cruel mirage. The reality was far more mundane and far more instructive about the nature of capitalism. The people who made the real lasting fortunes were not the miners, but the merchants, the entrepreneurs, and the opportunists who figured out that the most valuable commodity in the gold fields wasn't gold, it was everything else. The miners were a captive market, and the merchants who supplied them could charge whatever they wanted. Prices in the camps were astronomical, a function of scarcity, difficulty of transport, and pure, unadulterated price gouging. A single egg could sell for $1, a day's wages back east, a pound of flour, a shovel, or a pair of sturdy boots could cost a small fortune in gold dust. The men who had the foresight and the capital to set up supply stores, like the aforementioned Samuel Brannan, made staggering profits. They were mining the miners, and it was a far safer and more lucrative business. One of the most famous examples of this phenomenon was a young Bavarian immigrant named Levi Strauss. He arrived in San Francisco in 1853, intending to sell canvas for tents and wagon covers. He quickly realized that the miners needed something far more urgently. They needed trousers that could withstand the brutal conditions of the mines, pants that wouldn't fall apart after a few weeks of kneeling in mud and scraping against rocks. Using his durable canvas, he designed and produced the first pairs of what would one day become known as blue jeans. They were an instant success. Levi Strauss never swung a pickaxe in his life, but he built a global empire by clothing the men who did. Others found their fortunes in providing services. Men who were willing to cook, do laundry, or cut hair could make more in a day than most miners made in a week. The saloons and gambling halls, of course, raked in gold dust, hand over fist. And then there were the men who controlled the infrastructure. Men like Leland Stanford, Collis Huntington, Mark Hopkins, and Charles Crocker, the Big Four, were merchants in Sacramento who made their initial fortunes selling supplies. But they saw the bigger picture. They used their profits to invest in the project that would truly transform California, the Central Pacific Railroad. They understood that the real gold wasn't in the ground. It was in controlling the transportation and commerce that the gold rush had unleashed. They would become the new kings of California, their wealth and power dwarfing that of any lucky prospector. The story of the gold rush is, in this sense, a brutal lesson in economics. The vast majority of the 49 heirs ended their California adventure broke, sick, and disillusioned. They had gambled everything and lost. Many limped back home, with nothing to show for their efforts but broken health and haunting memories. Others were too ashamed or too poor to return and simply disappeared into the anonymous landscape of the new territory. The dream had been a lottery, and like all lotteries, the number of winners was infinitesimally small compared to the vast sea of losers. The gold they had traveled thousands of miles to find had flowed right through their fingers, ending up in the pockets of the shopkeepers, the bankers, and the railroad barons who had been clever enough to build the system that profited from their labor and their dashed hopes. The gold rush burned itself out almost as quickly as it began. By the mid-1850s, the easy gold, the flakes and nuggets that could be plucked from rivers with a simple pan, was gone. What remained was locked away deep in the earth, accessible only through complex and expensive industrial mining techniques like hydraulic mining, which required massive amounts of capital and organized labor. The era of the individual prospector, the romantic hero of the gold rush, was over. He was replaced by the wage laborer, working for a large corporation in dangerous conditions for a meager salary. The dream of independence had been replaced by the reality of industrial capitalism. But the legacy of those few frantic years was nothing short of monumental. The gold rush was the single most transformative event in the history of the American West. Before 1848, California was a sparsely populated pastoral backwater. By the end of the 1850s, it was a booming, multicultural, and globally connected economic powerhouse. The rush triggered a massive wave of immigration that turned San Francisco from a sleepy village into a bustling international metropolis overnight. It accelerated California's path to statehood, admitting it to the Union in 1850 and forever shifting the country's political and economic center of gravity westward. It financed a significant portion of the Union's efforts in the Civil War. It created a new class of ultra-wealthy industrialists who would go on to shape the nation's destiny. But this legacy came at a terrible, brutal cost. For the Native American populations of California, the gold rush was not a dream. It was an apocalypse. The influx of hundreds of thousands of miners, onto their ancestral lands was an invasion. The miners, driven by greed and a virulent racism, saw the native people as obstacles to be removed. They were hunted, murdered, and driven from their lands. State-sanctioned militias carried out campaigns of extermination. Disease and starvation did the rest. The native population of California, estimated to be around 150,000 before the gold rush, had plummeted to just 30,000 by 1870. It was a genocide, a dark and bloody stain on the golden legacy of the state. The environmental cost was equally devastating. The new industrial mining techniques, especially hydraulic mining, were catastrophic. Entire hillsides were blasted away with high-pressure water cannons, choking the rivers with millions of tons of sediment, destroying farmland downstream, and poisoning the water with mercury used to separate the gold. The landscape of the Sierra Nevada foothills was permanently scarred, a wounded testament to the destructive power of the rush. The gold built an empire, but it was an empire founded on a landscape of ruins and a history of ghosts. The story of the gold rush is the story of America itself, a tale of incredible creation and incredible destruction, of boundless opportunity and profound injustice, a glittering dream with a shadow that stretches to this very day. And now, the frantic search is over. The clamor of the camps fades into a distant echo. The wild hopes and bitter disappointments dissolve into the quiet dust of history. The fever has broken. There is no more gold to find tonight, no more rivers to pan, no more mountains to cross. There is only the gentle weight of the past, a story told and a lesson learned. The journey is done. Let the silence of the vast western sky settle over you. Feel the exhaustion of the long trail, the deep, earned weariness of the miners at the end of a fruitless day. Let it pull you down, not into the cold river water, but into the warm, soft depths of your bed. The rush is over. The world can wait until morning. It's time to rest. It's time to sleep.